Heroin and fentanyl, two opioids fueling a deadly addiction. One is killing far more people than the other. One is terrifyingly easy to manufacture. One is cheaper, and it hits even harder. But both leave devastation behind. They're ripping through communities, destroying lives, and leaving only pain in their wake. They may share the same path of destruction, but you might be surprised by just how different those two drugs are. To understand the power of these drugs and the current opioid crisis, you need some history, so let's start with heroin. People have used and abused opioids for millennia. There are Sumerian clay tablets that talk about prescriptions of opium, and that was 8,000 years ago. The ancient Greeks, Romans, Indians, Chinese, Egyptians, and Europeans in the Middle Ages all had a culture of opium use, and sometimes abuse. That sticky dark brown paste was often regarded as a panacea, a treatment for pain, colds, coughs, or something for your chronic melancholy. Laudanum, an opium tincture, was lauded by poets and writers who use it as a muse. Things got more serious in 1805 when the Germans isolated morphine from opium, which is about 10 times stronger. It doesn't feel as dreamy, but it hits the spot hard, especially after a Scotsman and separately a Frenchman invented the hypodermic syringe in the 1840s. There were no laws in those days about opioid or morphine use. The British had already become the world's first major drug traffickers when they flooded China with Indian opium, at a time when an estimated 10 to 27% of the population was addicted, with some provinces seeing addiction rates as high as 80%. Of course, it eventually came to American shores. During the Civil War, the Union Army gave about 10 million opium pills to their men, along with close to 2.8 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures. This created what you might call an early opioid crisis. But then came heroin. It was far more unforgiving than opium and morphine. It was invented by an Englishman in 1874 and later famously sold by Bayer as an over-the-counter cough suppressant. It was a drug that the company said could address your schizophrenia, help with your asthma, deal with your stomach cancer, and even calm up your crying baby. With morphine already addicting a small number of people, Bayer called heroin a non-addictive morphine substitute. These words were as devilishly deceitful as an American company many decades later, which would say something similar about OxyContin, a drug about which they said less than 1% would become addicted, which we now know as the lie of the century. At 2 to 4 times stronger than morphine and packing a much more pleasant punch, the abuse potential for heroin was actually very high. Still, not many people took it in the USA in the early days, or anywhere else for that matter. It wasn't until the early Prohibition that enterprising citizens realized illegality meant huge profits. With the help of European organized crime, dealers started flooding poor neighborhoods with it. It went from being used by writers, musicians, and intellectuals to a drug that preyed on the poor. This led to a seemingly endless war that would cost over $1 trillion just in the USA. So that's a very short history of heroin in a small but warm and comfortable nutshell. We'll talk about what it actually does for a person and the damage it causes later. But let's have a look at the even shorter history of fentanyl. Fentanyl was first synthesized in Belgium in 1960 by a Belgian chemist chasing the next big breakthrough in pain relief. Just 3 years later, it was already being delivered by syringe as a powerful anesthetic. By 1968, hospitals in the USA had adopted it, a potent intravenous drug 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. The chemists had already created heavy hitters like phenoparidine and meperidine, both stronger than morphine, but fentanyl was the ultimate painkiller. Despite its strength, fentanyl remained a drug used only in medical settings. In the 1980s, the first transdermal fentanyl was used, meaning someone battling chronic cancer pain could walk around all day with a patch on the back of their shoulder. Then, the chemists over in Belgium came up with something even stronger than fentanyl. It was an analog, just one of the analogs that would one day appear on the American streets. Its name was carfentanil, and it was strong. It could knock out an elephant, which was actually the purpose, to tranquilize large beasts. 100 times stronger than fentanyl and 10,000 times more potent than morphine. A mere speck of carfentanil could kill you. The Belgians also came up with fentanyl lollipops. These were for patients who might have anxiety before surgery and they didn't like needles. Oralette, a child-friendly version, came out in 1984. Years later, you could find a research paper on dental problems in the US because people were abusing fentanyl sucrose lozenges. While there were a handful of fentanyl deaths in the early 80s from people who managed to abuse it, it wasn't until the 2000s that it slipped into street society. Opioid use was evolving into a very different beast. America was soon awash with prescription opioids, setting the stage for a crisis. Eventually, the U.S., with just 4.4% of the world's population, would come to consume over 80% of the world's opioid supply. But why do Americans take so many opioids? That's the multi-billion-dollar question. The global prescription opioid business was worth $22.2 billion in 2023, but it's expected to reach $29.5 billion by 2034. And the U.S. is by far the biggest customer. For heroin, it's hard to say what the market is worth. Globally, UNODC said the heroin business was worth $55 billion in 2010. We don't know exactly how much the counterfeit synthetic opioids market is worth, but the business of all counterfeit drugs, according to a 2022 paper in the National Library of Medicine, is between $200 and $432 billion. The fake synthetic opioid business is huge, and it is only gonna get much bigger. As for the cost of all this addiction, a 2017 study said it was $1.02 trillion in the U.S. based on cash spent on things such as healthcare, law enforcement, justice, and prison. The cost globally would be astronomical, but it means it's a thriving industry sometimes called the opioid economy. One person's cost is another person's profit. The legal opioid business is said to be worth between $8 to $10 billion a year in the U.S., and this is after crackdowns on Big Pharma. Purdue Pharma, the company behind the notorious semi-synthetic OxyContin, made profits of $1.1 billion in 2000. From 2002 to 2003, OxyContin made $3 billion. But it's believed from 1996 to 2017, cumulative Oxy revenues totaled about $35 billion. And a lot of Purdue's products hit the streets. Heroin, which is almost identical to OxyContin in how it feels and what it does to the brain, was being left in the dust. Then you have companies such as McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen. Together, they made tens of billions of dollars over the years of the opioid crisis, selling billions of opioid pills in the U.S. During the worst of the crisis, it was a free-for-all as these firms cashed in on overprescription and weak regulations. As for the customers, the regular patients, surely if it came from your doctor, you couldn't be an addict. One man who on Reddit said his dentist prescribed him Oxy after his wisdom tooth was removed, and the next line it says, "It ruined my life, man." For what he called the absolute comfort and warmth of OxyContin, he gave up sex, he neglected his family, he was dipping in the cosmos, and then slowly but surely, he was delivered into what he called the arms of the devil. This kicked off a new era of addiction in which regular addicts also wanted pills even after their so-called pill mills closed down. They now wanted the good stuff instead of the dope on the streets, whose quality wasn't as reliable as the heroin equivalents made by Big Pharma. Pills ruled, but fentanyl was waiting in the wings. In 2023, the opioid use disorder market was valued at roughly $3.2 billion. That includes everything from medications to help you quit, to addiction management programs, to detox clinics. This market is predicted to fly as we head into the 2030s, hitting an expected $7.51 billion by 2032. Some sources estimate $10.24 billion. This alone is a sign that the war on drugs is, to say the least, not going very well. The CDC said there were 125 million opioid prescriptions in the U.S. in 2023. For many people, these drugs are a lifesaver, but somewhere between 9 and 10 million Americans abuse prescription opioids, meaning they're either taking someone else's pills, stealing them, doing more than they're prescribed, or getting them on the street. 1 to 1.1 million Americans will have taken heroin within the past year, and it's thought that there are about 902,000 people who are considered full-time heroin addicts. But these days, users might try to get a bag of heroin only to find out that their bag of goodies is actually fentanyl. It's not just a substitute anymore. Fentanyl is taking over the opioid market. To better understand the change, we need to look at the waves of the opioid crisis. Wave 1 began in the late 90s and early 2000s, when Big Pharma took advantage of weak regulations and overprescribed pain meds. They often paid doctors to prescribe and unleashed unethical marketing campaigns. In 2010, Wave 2 hit the shores as Big Pharma said, "Sorry," after the government engaged in some hand-slapping. But it was too little too late. It paid some big fines, money that mostly went back to the government and law firms, and this was when many new addicts who can no longer get those highly addictive pills went to the streets to score heroin. Wave 3 marked the rise of synthetic opioids, when counterfeit pills flooded the streets. This is when fentanyl started to make an appearance. Now we're seeing Wave 4, Though it hasn't officially been named, this is the phase where people take cocaine or pop a Xanax and then suddenly drop dead. Fentanyl is so effective and so relatively easy to make, suppliers are now slipping it into just about every illegal drug, including cocaine, meth, fake Xanax, and fake OxyContin. And if users don't die, they usually like it. They might think that it's the best Xanax ever because they're actually taking a very addictive pain-killing euphoria pill, not anti-anxiety medication. There have already been many deaths from these tainted drugs, and it's a problem that won't go away. In California alone, seizures from 2021 to 2023 went up from around 5,300 pounds to just over 62,200 pounds. In 2023, the DEA said it seized 80 million fake fentanyl pills, enough for 390 million doses. The agency later said 6 out of the 10 pills it found and tested contained enough to kill a novice user. A paper published by the National Institutes of Health said it was more likely that 115 million pills were seized that year, explaining that this was 2,300 times more than in 2017. In 2019, fentanyl only made up about 32% of all opioid seizures in the U.S. In 2024, it was 94%. As for the powder, U.S. authorities seized almost 3,100 pounds in 2019. Since then, it's not been lower than 9,900 pounds and has been as high as 26,500 pounds. It's believed seizures make up only about 5 to 10% of what is trafficked, but could be much less given how much gets made. More about that later. Things changed drastically around 2020. That was when much more fentanyl started being found than heroin. In January 2022, just 41 pounds of heroin was seized, compared to 862 pounds of fentanyl. In February 2025, 101 pounds of heroin was seized, compared to 603 pounds of fentanyl. The losers are the producers and transporters of heroin. Although it seems that they're now switching to fentanyl, making and transporting heroin is just too risky, expensive, and labor-intensive. Once a year, farmers will harvest their opium crops by slicing the bulb of the opium poppy, which releases its powerful sap. This sticky brown substance is dissolved in hot water and then mixed with lime and ammonium chloride. After it's boiled down, what's left is morphine paste. And that paste is then heated with acetic anhydride and baking soda before being dried, filtered, and purified, and the result is heroin, which is ready to be shipped off to someone in the West where it's diluted and sold on the streets. The Mexicans tend to make black tar because it's easy and cheap to refine, and it seems addicts in the western states and midwestern regions of the U.S. have gotten used to it. The superior China White from Asia is usually sold on the East Coast. White heroin is almost unheard of in the UK. Heroin pills wouldn't work because the body would break it down before it hits the brain. But fentanyl, well, it's multi-purpose and it can be snorted, injected, smoked, and unlike heroin, taken in a pill. Still, get the amount wrong by even a tiny bit and you are likely to die. Fentanyl doesn't require big fields in Asia or bands of poor farmers. There's no need for shipping containers or complex global smuggling routes. As long as the ingredients are available, aka chemical precursors, chefs can start cooking in their own small kitchens. It's mixed, boiled, filtered, and dried, and just 2.2 pounds of fentanyl is 500,000 to 1 million potentially lethal doses. The New York Times was allowed to visit a lab in Mexico in 2024, where 2 guys in a house kitchen said that they were just finishing off an order for 22 pounds. This was a small, drab kitchen, and they were using standard cooking equipment that you can buy anywhere. They told the Times, "This is what makes us rich. Just $5,000 of precursors is enough to make 2.2 pounds, which will sell for about $1 million on the streets." And these guys in the kitchen with their little saucepans were small-time players, whose bosses in the Sinaloa cartel were buying sports cars and small airplanes. As for the difficulty of cooking, one of the guys said it was about as hard as making tacos. After the U.S. got serious with Mexico about fentanyl in 2024, one single bust in Sinaloa pulled in a batch of almost 1,800 pounds, with another 660 pounds in a house nearby, plus a huge stash of those precursor chemicals. This was effectively enough to murder everyone in the USA. In a separate bust, they got 4.4 pounds of pills, 20 million doses, worth around $400 million on the U.S. streets. In short, fentanyl is so potent that producing even small amounts can make someone rich. Compare that to black tar heroin. Grown in opium fields in Mexico, it costs around $3,000 to $5,000 per kilo to produce, and it sells for $50,000 to $100,000. But growing it means higher risks. Fields can be raided, and large shipments are easier to intercept. In terms of running a profitable business, heroin just doesn't make sense. And this is really bad news for the US. In fact, given the profits, synthetics will no doubt become a very substantial global problem. Heroin requires a larger dose to get high. In most countries, a single bag costs around $10 and contains about 0.1 grams. So 10 bags makes up a gram. Depending on the quality, that gram might cost anywhere from $80 to $150 if bought all at once. How much you take depends on your tolerance. But first, it makes you feel euphoric. It helps you forget. That's how it starts. That's why it's addictive. Over time, you're no longer chasing a high, you're just trying to avoid the sickness. Soon, you could be using half a gram to a full gram a day, sometimes more. That's when it gets expensive, especially if you can't afford to buy it in bulk like most addicts. A lot will depend on purity. When it's taken from the streets and tested in a lab, it's usually anywhere from 10 to 60% pure. The fact that there's so much low-quality heroin in the streets is one of the reasons for the rise of synthetics. Like heroin, fentanyl is sold at wildly varying prices depending on quality, sometimes straight from the bargain basement of addiction. Recent reports out of Washington show pills going for as little as 50 cents, with some selling for $5. Still, they might cost $25 or even $50. It depends on what's inside of them. The exact amount of pure fentanyl in each pill is anyone's guess, and that is the problem. If it's too pure, it could be the last hit you ever take. Just a dose smaller than a single grain of sugar is enough to kill. But is it worth the risk? What do these drugs feel like? About 30 seconds to a minute after injection, heroin users feel a warm wave spread from the arm up to the head. The rush of euphoria comes from a surge of dopamine flooding the brain's pleasure center, the nucleus accumbens. At the same time, the drug dulls both physical and emotional pain by binding to the body's opioid receptors. Even smoking on foil or snorting brings on a sudden relief, but the initial rush is not as strong. And that's why injecting is so much more dangerous. It effectively relaxes you so much that your overwhelmed brain stops sending signals to breathe. The heroin might last only an hour or two, but the body will remain kind of high for maybe 4 to 6 hours. After this, the user will need more. With fentanyl, it's an almost instantaneous eclipse of the body. That's because of its lipid solubility. This means it crosses the blood-brain barrier even faster than heroin, overwhelming your brain even more. Users are high in a matter of seconds, but the buzz might only last 30 to 90 minutes or maybe 2 hours at most, which means they need to score again. Interviews with addicts in San Francisco revealed that many don't even like the fentanyl high. Some called it too synthetic, nothing like the warm blanket of heroin. They missed heroin's hug, comparing it to fentanyl's cold gut punch. Heroin, they said, had soul. Fentanyl just sends you off a cliff rather than coming down easy. Users say that this can make withdrawal from fentanyl harder because it hurts so much more. The top answer on a Reddit post asking the hardest drug to quit said, "Fentanyl was. I was hooked on heroin for years and transitioned to fentanyl because it was more bang for my buck." In the next sentence about withdrawal, they wrote, "I prayed for death." Of course, not all opioid users prefer the heroin high. One user who was interviewed said, "Fentanyl has an excellent rush," explaining that he thought the high was way better than heroin, but it, quote, "only lasts a couple hours and then you're sick again." Another user said fentanyl made him feel like King Kong or Godzilla, saying the rush is 10 times stronger. Still, many other users said it felt mucky or dirty, with the added downer that it was killing their friends faster than a modern plague. Many users say they now feel like they've been trapped in fentanyl's wicked toxic grip, but these days that's often all there is on the streets. They must continually risk their lives to get high. Some users reported what they called the best of both worlds, which was fentanyl mixed with quality heroin. So you got the intense rush along with heroin's long-lasting warm euphoria. So the bad news for opioid users is that fentanyl kills you very easily, and if you're an addict, it's going to be much easier to find than heroin. Chasing heroin on foil makes a fatal overdose unlikely, but with fentanyl it's a different story. One single line can be enough to kill you. Because of that risk, many users have shifted from injecting to smoking. But now, for the first time, there are more overdoses from smoking than from shooting up. Of the 806 overdose deaths in San Francisco in 2023, 653 were from fentanyl, and this is a trend all over the USA. If we look at the entire country, back in 2016, there were about 33,000 opioid overdose deaths, and only about 29% involved fentanyl. After 2021, the total number of opioid deaths per year has been over 80,000, with fentanyl being involved in around 80% of them. Of the total 107,000 U.S. drug overdoses in 2023, about 70% involved fentanyl. Before 2010, stimulant overdose deaths, like those from cocaine or meth, rarely involved opioids. But after 2020, synthetic opioids like fentanyl have been linked to over 20,000 stimulant deaths. It's taking over the drug scene, and it's only going to show up in more illicit drugs as time goes on. It's too cheap, too easy to make, and far too addictive not to. Heroin is very bad, it's ruined countless lives, but fentanyl is disastrous. Taking it is like playing with fire when you're already covered in gasoline. And now, there are countless analogs on the streets. As you've seen, it'll almost be impossible to stop the production of synthetics. So what does the future hold? Well, despite the war and trillions spent, the world's drug problem has gotten worse and worse. Part of the blame for today's opioid catastrophe in the US falls on Big Pharma. But government policy played a role too. By banning much weaker drugs in the past, officials helped create a thriving underground economy that kept evolving towards stronger, more dangerous substances. Illicit fentanyl wasn't an anomaly, it was the next step in criminal evolution. And with safer alternatives wiped out, what we got in return was a flood of deadly synthetics. Where there's demand, there's always supply. Enforcement may cause brief price spikes or spark more violence, but it rarely stops the flow. That's why critics call the war on drugs one of the most disastrous policies in human history. Even the UN Secretary General labeled it an utter failure. It couldn't have gone worse. Yet the war itself has become a global industry. Like it or not, it's embedded in the economy. There's no easy fix. Dismantling the war on drugs would be a complex, messy process. But if there is one place to start, it's reducing the demand. What do you think is the most shocking difference between heroin and fentanyl? Is there a way to stop this latest opioid crisis? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now you need to watch Doctors Are Terrified of the New Zombie Drug. This is why. Or have a look at insane drugs you didn't know existed.